the premier event of the year, even bigger many times than the throne speech, because this is when the government lays out its plan. They speak in generalities a lot of times. This is when hard numbers are put to what they're actually intending to do or to not do. And this particular budget, I would say, has been really anticipated because last year was such a large error on the projection of royalties, not just on potash, but also on oil, although in that case it was to the good, that everybody was curious to see what would the numbers be this year, what kind of projections, and how would the government rein back in a couple of years of pretty hefty spending increases.
My first one was 1983, so I haven't many since that I can remember, so that makes it my 27th budget. You can get a lot in when you start when you're 12 years old. Budgets are not nearly as much fun as Grey Cups or Olympics, I can tell you that right now. I mean, I've covered a few Grey Cups and Olympics. I'll tell you that the budgets are far less fun, but I can also tell you that they're probably in many realistic ways way more important. What normally happens, and I think most of the public knows and understands this, is that we get an embargoed copy the day before, where we have to swear and sign an agreement that we don't discuss and release any details of the budget prior to the delivery by the finance minister.
Budgets are, by nature, kind of drudgery. There's a lot of numbers, there's a lot of things to plow through, and reporters and news people generally got into this because they're not good with math to start with, so it's extra work for us. Generally, we get the budget a day in advance, and a group of us get together and start going through all the different releases, and really the numbers that are contained in the budget documents themselves. What does this mean? There's always some interesting stuff buried on purpose, sort of deep within the budget, and that's what you're hoping to find. The part that the government isn't wanting to talk about that they're hoping you won't find.
Yesterday was all about getting the document, reading all the details. It's some 100 pages long in terms of the main budget document, plus the estimate books are even longer. There's accompanying press releases. There's plenty of research to be done. In this very office, I sat down with half a dozen of my colleagues, and we hammered out what stories would work best, what stories would be most beneficial for the public to learn. We shared ideas in terms of how things should be covered and how things needed to be presented, what's the most important issue to the public. We did some pre-writing, I think for most of us that went on late until the evening, in my case probably till about 10, 11 o'clock, and I guess I was in this office about 7 in the morning, starting again because the briefing started roughly 8 in the morning in terms of the finance officials and others explaining that, and after the briefings we have embargoed press conferences with the opposition and others so we can pre-write.
There's no interest like self-interest, and people always want to know, how does this affect me? Sure, it's a $10 billion budget and has all these big numbers in it, but am I paying more to buy a 12 beer? That's what they really want to know. Or is my health care affected? So on a day like today, for instance, knowing that chiropractic visits are affected, knowing that health care budgets are limited compared to past years, knowing, for instance, that, they will pay more for beer and cigarettes, those are the sorts of things that people look for. And then there's a whole bunch of stories in budget that come out really in the days afterward as we get through the big stories and start to focus down on some of the other interesting stories that can't be told today very well.
The neat stories that I always find emerging from the budget happened where I just came from, which is the rotunda of the legislature, and people talking about how the budget will affect them or affect their interest groups in which the stakeholder represents. Sometimes we see them as stakeholders and we sort of see that as meaning, oh well, they just a vested interest here to make noise and squawk on budget day. But they really represent a lot of people whose lives are very much affected by the process that went on here today. And what they say is really important.
I mean, let's face it, there's a lot of spin on budget day. And if you can't cut through the spin cycle, you're going to be effectively telling the story of news releases, and that's usually not the real story. So if you just read the budget online, and I encourage people to do so, or to pick up a copy, that's great. But when you get good journalists asking hard questions, you're going to get, hopefully, to the real story. In terms of being down and broadcasting live, we started in 1999, was our first time. And at that time, it was kind of a new thing to come down and set up a broadcast location and do do the budget live, and I remember the first one really well because it was an oddity, and this weird dynamic happened where every politician kind of wanted to be on the radio, because if you weren't being interviewed, somehow you weren't somebody, and it seemed to catch on. We've been doing it ever since, and now it's one of the signatures of what we do every year in terms of live coverage. We bring the budget live, but most of all, we bring the people who are here live to give their take on it and what it means to people.
The great thing about having a newspaper and working for a newspaper is we're probably the only media outlet that can offer a definitive, thoughtful, all-encompassing package of all those thoughts, of all those ideas, of all that collective wisdom that was in the rotunda today, because we have the resources to and the space the next day to be able to present that. My job is to cover the laws that are made in this building. The budget is the biggest law that you'll see. It's a $10 billion law. And think about $10 billion in the context of how that affects your life. You know, for all of us out here, what happens in the course of the budget affects us. And so it's the biggest story because I think it affects the most people in the broadest way. And I think that's always the best measure for news.